Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and I thought I'd make this quick off-the-cuff video to share my thoughts about the brand new teaser trailer for Star Wars Episode 9. Is it actually a teaser trailer? Because this thing seems to be as long, or almost as long as a regular trailer. But regardless, it's a teaser trailer. That's what we've been told it is. So here's my thoughts. Yes, this does contain some impressive-looking cinematography, some impressive-looking visuals, some seemingly exciting-looking moments. But in response to that, I would say, so what? We've already had some impressive looking visuals in previous trailers for films that weren't good, including The Last Jedi. One thing that Disney has done really well, regardless of how good the movie turns out or not, is they have actually made really good trailers for all of the Star Wars films. They have made great trailers, but a great trailer does not a great movie make. And so for me, I am waiting and reserving my judgment. I'm not going to get sucked into the hype machine like I was previously. It takes more than some impressive looking visuals and some passionate Star Wars music for me to get excited now. There's been too many misses with this franchise, so I want to see the actual film. The title, what do I think? The Rise of Skywalker. Well, I am underwhelmed by the title. This to me, perhaps the only other title close to this would be Attack of the Clones. But generally, every other Star Wars trilogy film has had a title that has invoked a sense of mystery, something bigger, something going on here that's big, and something more than just a narrow and sort of very generic and very obviously descriptive title. This to me just feels too obviously descriptive. It feels too narrow. It strips out, and in this way actually is actually a kind of a symbol or a metaphor for how Star Wars has become under Disney, a very generic, formulaic kind of thing. And you just shoehorn in the Skywalker name, in this case, to the title. I'm not that impressed by it. Yeah, there's ways they can use this title and what this title could mean. There's a couple of options open to them. But it doesn't seem that impressive to me, and I don't even really know what they've got to work with, considering how badly the Skywalker name was treated in the previous film. Some people have said that they think that this is maybe JJ having a crack at Rian Johnson. I'm not convinced of that. I don't think that this is how things work at Disney. I think they are a lot more in agreement than you would like to think, or certainly they are a lot more supportive of each other, even if they might have disagreed with how different creative decisions that might have been made. So I don't think that that's what's going on here. To me, it's sort of symptomatic of something that's not quite right here. And I mean, I don't know. The thing about the previous titles was, and the way the previous stories happened was, yes, they were about the Skywalker saga, but they weren't just about the Skywalkers, these films. They were about the other heroes. It was a band of heroes. It wasn't just Luke, and it wasn't just Anakin. It was the people around them, and they were just as much part of the story. And the titles reflect that too. This was a story that happened in a sort of much bigger universe to a bigger group of people. It wasn't just one person. I don't know where they're going to go with it, but the title to me, it just speaks of the problems that Star Wars now has, the sort of creatively visionless, sort of methodical plodding along, the production of formulaic paint-by-numbers movies to try and make money, and they're based on nothing more than shoehorning in existing aspects of Star Wars that, you know, those formerly great stories, just shoehorning stuff out of them and into your movie. Another example of this was Lando in The Falcon. Lando wearing the same old clothes he was wearing previously. Why? Why is Lando even in this? It just seems to me that that's a classic example of shoehorning, and the fact that he's in the teaser trailer, why is he there? Shoehorning. It's an attempt to try and trick you into use it through the lens of nostalgia, with the angle of nostalgia. Hey, come and watch our film. It's going to be awesome. Remember, it was just like those other ones that we made. But to me, it's like bleh, and it sort of speaks to the creative bankruptcy of what's going on here. The return of Palpatine. That's a big thing about this trailer. The return of Palpatine. I don't think, my gut instinct is there's not going to be Emperor Palpatine. Some have suggested that maybe it's a recording, possibly. Maybe there's something else associated with Palpatine. Maybe it's going to be a backstory when he was younger. There might be something, some relic, some piece of computer code, some piece of a map or something that they need that Palpatine had. But if Palpatine is back, then this franchise is officially doomed. Because if they have actually brought Palpatine back, that speaks to how creatively bankrupt everything has now become at Star Wars. Because what it would mean is that Palpatine never died in the Death Star. That is absolutely absurd. There is no way that Palpatine could have survived that explosion. It's just an absurdity. And if they try and make that a reality, this will mean that after years of criticizing fans for their passionate theories and ideas about stories and attacking fans for having those, Disney will have produced the ultimate absurd fanboy theory, because that's what this would be. To make that happen would be an absolute absurdity. There's no way he would have survived it. Secondly, it will be a disaster for the story, because what it would mean is it would completely undo, it would completely destroy the very legacy of Luke Skywalker once and for all. It would undo the story which was so well bookended in the original trilogy, because what it would mean is that there was no victory. Skywalker never defeated the enemy, never defeated evil. There was no victory secured by the rebels, because Palpatine survived. He was still alive. The threat carried on existing. There was no good overcoming evil, because they never overcame the evil. It would be an absolute disaster if they did that. I'm not convinced they're going to do it. I think the laugh in there was just a bit of a tease to try and pique people's interest, but I'm not convinced there's going to be a real Palpatine. If there is Palpatine there and he survived, oh lordy, this thing is doomed in a big way. Lastly, but not leastly, two little comments about my reactions to the teaser trailer. Yesterday I posted some stuff on Twitter about it, and someone very charitably came back and challenged what I was saying. And by the way, I don't mind charitable criticism. As far as I'm concerned, that's a really good thing, and not enough of us are self-critical enough. We don't evaluate our own conduct and our the way we put ourselves out there enough. And so I'm okay with people constructively critiquing me. And this person did it very charitably, and they challenged me and suggested that perhaps I was being overly harsh, overly critical because we haven't seen the movie yet. In response to that person, you know who you are. Your tweets were most welcome, but respectfully, I disagree with you. And I'll tell you why I disagree with you. I'm not critiquing the movie. It doesn't exist yet, so there's nothing to critique. I'm not examining the movie. My critique is of this teaser trailer and what I see here. Secondly, I'd say that I think my reaction here, being cynical, is actually the rational position to adopt. Why? Because The Last Jedi was a disaster and The Force Awakens was creatively bankrupt. So fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, hello, something odd is going on here that needs to be questioned. Fool me three times, shame on me. It's all my fault now because I'm not thinking rationally and I walked back into this trap for a third time. So I'm not going to be suckered in a third time. I think being cynical is the right position to adopt now because we've had so many misses with this new handling of the franchise by Disney. And then lastly, there might be people out there who are thinking, well, hold on a minute, why does this even matter at all? What's the big deal? You know, there's big problems going on in Western society right now. Why are you so worried about a teaser trailer for Star Wars? Well, in response to that I'd say, well, I think this kind of matters actually. In the big scheme of things, is as a movie as big as a political decision or a war or famine or any of those other things that plague people, existential suffering and loneliness and isolation and the breakdown of community? No. But stories are important. Why? Well, I've believed this for a long time. You can tell a lot about a culture by the state of the art that it is producing and the stories that it is telling. And if your culture is in touch with the bigger picture and has got good sound philosophy and has got a good handle on its humanity, is still very humanized, compassionate, humane, philosophically grounded in the truth, then what happens? The art, as a general rule, that it produces and the stories it tells are going to be connected to things that are good, true and beautiful. But if the stories that it's telling are creatively bankrupt, the art it's producing is creatively bankrupt, and it's nothing more than a sort of utilitarian paint-by-numbers equation to try and churn out just a product to make money and nothing more, then I would suggest your culture is in a spot of bother if that's happening. Because those studios, those people who produce these films, they are formed and shaped by the culture that they are living in. They are a product, and so is their art. Their art is a product of that culture. And when one of the biggest franchises, the biggest Odyssey franchise of the modern era in cinema, Star Wars, is churning out garbage, then I think it's something that's worth taking note of and worth commenting on. But there you go. For what it's worth, that is my thoughts on the brand new teaser trailer. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Please let me know what you think. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how to do that are found in the video description below. Thank you for watching. See you next time on Left Foot Media. Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and today we're going to be talking about the downfall of new Star Wars. Now, whenever people like me, who have great frustration and even a sense of sadness for what could have been over the demise of the new Star Wars trilogy, the fact that it is now imploded in on itself like a dying star in an absolute hot mess, there is a tendency amongst those who can see the problems to blame Rian Johnson for this and to suggest that he is the one who is the cause of all of this. In actual fact, he's not. If you go back and look at The Force Awakens, you can see that it was actually The Force Awakens where the problems began for the new trilogy, and there's some pretty big issues there. So in today's video, I want to look at 4 major problems that were there right from the very beginning with The Force Awakens, and 3 of them in particular are specific to The Force Awakens, and I think they're huge, and that they have done untold harm to the new Star Wars trilogy. And then I also, rather than just complaining, I also want to offer what I think could have been basically a positive piece of constructive criticism for what could have been, how things could have been different, how the story actually could have been better. Because it's one thing to complain about stuff, it's another thing to propose alternatives and solutions. And so that's what I want to do today. So let's get into it. Now, one thing that everyone knows by now about Star Wars, one of the biggest and most popular film franchises in the entire history of cinema, is that Star Wars trilogies tell their story over 3 films. And when you talk about sequels in Star Wars, they're not like anthology sequels where, you have basic connection to the previous film by way of characters and they happen in the same universe, and then you tell a different story each time. Star Wars trilogies tell their story over 3 films. You start at the beginning and then you unfold and you conclude in the 3rd and final film. We all know that's the pattern of Star Wars, and this new trilogy was supposed to be the same. But the problem was, and we know this now from hindsight, from all the information and comments that have come out since, that basically there was no creative oversight that had a sort of total vision, if you like, for the whole story over the 3 films. Instead, you've effectively got creative activity by committee, and that's the worst way that you can do this. Different people forming a committee and just all ad hoc adding their bit. Well, not quite ad hoc, but everyone just adding their bit. And what you end up when you try and do creativity by committee is generally you end up with confusion, and you generally end up with a bit of a Frankenstein, and that's really what we've got now with this trilogy. And there's some really obvious signs that this is the case, and we see this between the 1st and 2nd films, between the Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. A glaring example of this is the character of Snoke. Snoke as a character is clearly being set up. He is supposed to have a big role in the story, but in the 2nd film, his character arc, his journey in the story, just comes to a very abrupt end. And it's clear by the fact that there's just not enough padding and fleshing out of that character that happened, that this really shouldn't have happened. This is not a good piece of storytelling here. There should have been more here. Even if he was going to die in the second film, that's not the issue whether he dies or not. It's just, as a character, clearly he's been crafted in the first film in one way, but in the second film he sort of quickly comes to an end. And the problem with that is that there's nothing really meaningful about him as a character. His death doesn't really carry much in the way of significance, certainly not for us as an audience, and definitely not in the lives of those characters. He's clearly being set up to be the overarching supervillain, but then he quickly comes to an end in the second film. There's not really much we know about him. He doesn't seem that important because we're not told. He kind of seems important, but then we're not told enough about him to actually even understand why he might be important. And the whole thing clearly is a classic example of, as I said, creativity, or an attempt at creativity by committee, instead of someone who has an overarching vision for how that character should actually play out over a much sort of bigger story. Another example of this is the ending, the way in which The Last Jedi sort of just comes to an end, and you're left with the situation where you've got a second film that actually feels like the third and final film in a trilogy that doesn't really leave us with much of a way forward from here. There's lots of things between these two films that show us, and as I said, the subsequent comments that we've had from people who worked on these films, the directors themselves, clearly show us that there wasn't a collaborative and coherent plan for how to actually tell the story, and that did not begin with Rian Johnson. Rian Johnson stepped into that. That is something, that template, that platform was built before him, and he just was slotted into it. You can't blame Rian Johnson for that. That's there right at the very beginning. Now, what's interesting is, I think a lot of people instinctively know this, but they still desperately don't want to admit it, and this is why we got the whole subverting expectations excuse. Subverting expectations became a way of excusing these glaring flaws between the two films, the way the story was unfolding. And so what people would do is they would say, oh, you're just upset because you had some big elaborate fan theory and this film subverted your expectations. That's really not what happened here. For a lot of people, clearly the first film sets up a whole lot of things and starts heading in a particular trajectory, and then the second film just doesn't deliver because there's no real creative oversight here as to how that second film should play out in relation to the first film, in continuity with the fact that this is supposed to be a story over 3 films. That aspect of it is missing. And so what happens is, when the second film doesn't really deliver in a way that's kind of coherent from a storytelling perspective, people who wanted to defend it started making this justification. Oh, it subverted expectations. You know, you're sure you were expecting a story to sort of unfold and flourish in a more natural way, but hey, this is some sort of art house subversion of that, and you're the one with the problem. No, clearly the problem here, as I said, is an attempt at creativity by committee, and when you do that, you don't end up with coherent storytelling. What you end up with as a general norm, and there are obviously some exceptions that sort of prove the norm, but the general norm is you end up with a bit of a Frankenstein. That wasn't caused by The Last Jedi. That wasn't caused by Rian Johnson. That problem was already present right from the very beginning. The second big problem with new Star Wars, and this is right there from the very beginning in The Force Awakens, is that Rey is a Mary Sue. She is not a well-written character. Basically, she doesn't need anyone or anything to complete her as a character. Therefore, there is no drama. Without drama, there's no tension. There's nothing for her to overcome. She can just overcome things. It's like magic. She's just got these powers that enable her to be superhuman and weird in that way, in the fact that she's just too powerful in the story. And what happens is there's no drama or tension around her. Even if you don't notice it and you don't sort of consciously see that, effectively your experience of the story is definitely lessened as a result of this. She's also a character that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Even aside from her perfection, she is too, what's the word? Perhaps she's too full of virtue. She's not rough enough. She's not actually the type of character she should be. This is a girl who was dumped on a planet and sold into slavery effectively in a very harsh environment, as a young child by her parents who she hasn't seen since. And yet she kind of seems like a modern teen in a high school, living at home with both her parents who love her, and she's just got a little bit of angst around the edges and is trying to find her way in the world and is not sure what she's going to do with her life when she leaves high school. That's kind of the maximum level of angst that she's got going on in her life. She should be quite a jaded character. She should be suspicious of people. She shouldn't really have much in the way of hope, I'd suggest, because there's no clear reason for why she would have that hope. She should be a diamond in the rough. She should be a cynical, hardened type of character. She's not. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, the response from those who are defenders of The Last Jedi and of The Force Awakens is to say, oh, you just don't like the fact that the lead character in the new Star Wars film, that the new main hero is a female. You're just basically a misogynistic man baby, and that's your problem. It's just pure brute force sexism and nothing more. No, that's not what's going on here at all. For starters, go back to the original trilogy. Our three main characters, our three main heroes, who are they? Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Princess Leia. And everyone loved Princess Leia and still does. She is one of the most beloved characters in the entire history of Star Wars. Everyone loved her. I remember as a young boy wanting to have her toys. Everyone did. There was just no issue there around sexism. Why? Because she's a well-written character. She's not superhuman. She's not weirdly alien-like and doesn't quite fit in. Her character, who she is and who she's meant to be in the story, it all makes sense. Secondly is the fact that the same people who are pointing out the glaringly obvious flaws in the character of Rey also have a great love for other female action sci-fi lead characters. So, for example, two really glaring examples of this are Ripley in the Aliens franchise and Sarah Connor in the Terminator franchise, particularly in T2, which is a much loved film. And when you think about both of those characters, they are not bystanders in the story. They are not portrayed in a sort of weak, inferior to the men kind of way. They are the lead characters. They do possess the important knowledge. They are the ones who are directing traffic and saving the day. They actually have to show the men where they're making mistakes, but everyone loves them. Why? Because they are not poorly written characters. Think about the character of Sarah Connor in Terminator 2. She's this character who has definitely, or certainly portrays a lot of very masculine traits. She's muscled up. She has got herself an armory. She's got a plan for how to save the world. She's not afraid to use physical force when she needs to. There's nothing about that character that is sort of feminine and weak and is nothing more than a mere bystander in the story, but everyone loves her. Why? Because she has struggle, she has drama. Despite all of those characteristics that Sarah Connor has, and Ripley in her movie as well, like, they can't single-handedly defeat the bad guys. They don't possess magic powers to just overcome any problem that they are confronted with. Rey has those kind of powers, and that ruins her as a character. Sarah Connor cannot just destroy Terminators. She doesn't have that power. She has to run from them still. She has to overcome the odds. She doesn't have the power to just instantly stop nuclear war. Ripley doesn't have the power to destroy aliens and understand them and communicate them and mind meld with them and subdue them or anything like that. She still has the struggle, the drama, the tension. It exists in the story. Her character is meaningful to us because she has to overcome the odds. Think about the character of Luke in the original trilogy. Let's imagine that Luke was Lucy and it was written as a female character. She would have been a great character. If in the original trilogy Luke had been Lucy, that would have been a great character. We all would have loved it. Why? Because think about all the struggle that's going on for that character. You've got an aunt and uncle who won't let him live out his dreams. You've got Han Solo who looks down on this guy and thinks of him as nothing more than sort of a naive little boy who doesn't know about the world and doesn't really offer much in the way that's special. Han even mocks him at certain stages in A New Hope. You've got Princess Leia, who initially isn't that impressed. Aren't you a little short to be a stormtrooper? And also, Luke has to do what? He has to have absolute trust in Obi-Wan at the very end of the film, the pinnacle moment. He's the hero that saves the day, and what has he got to do? He doesn't do it by himself. He doesn't just sort of flourish into magic superpower land. What happens with Luke is he has to listen and trust Obi-Wan. You know, turn off your targeting computer, use the Force, and that's what saves the day. His character is meaningful. He has struggle, he has drama, he has tension. Rey doesn't. That's not Rian Johnson's problem. That character was written and handed to him, and it was given to us in The Force Awakens. It's a huge problem, and it's there right from the very beginning. And I would say, to his credit, Rian Johnson actually tried to, I think, give a little bit of attention to the character of Rey in his film. Now, he produced the worst, I think, of any of the Star Wars trilogy films that have ever been made, but there's no doubt that he has tried to give some drama and tension to that character that is woefully lacking in The Force Awakens. The third major flaw with The Force Awakens was the fact that it destroyed the character of Han Solo. Now, there's a bit of an irony here, because one thing that Rian Johnson gets a lot of criticism about is the fact that he destroyed the character of Luke Skywalker. He took that character, mishandled that character in the writing of the story, and effectively destroyed the legacy of a much beloved character. But the irony is that J.J. Abrams actually destroyed the character of Han Solo. He seems to have gotten away with it. Very few people actually criticize him for this, but his destruction of a major character, I think, was just as bad as the way Luke was handled in the second film, in The Last Jedi. Now, I'm not talking here about the death of Han Solo. There's no problem with a character like that dying. That's not the issue. I mean the destruction of the character as a whole. The character's legacy, the way the character is handled. That character was destroyed by the way that he was written in The Force Awakens. Now, as I said, the death is not the problem. Harrison Ford actually wanted Han Solo to die back in Return of the Jedi. He wanted him to die in the first act of Return of the Jedi, because he thought, he told George Lucas this, that he thought it would sort of amp the stakes up. Basically, that the stakes would be really high at that point. If we saw a major character die very early in that final film, we'd think, holy moly, anyone could die. It's one of those kind of films. Now, George Lucas disagreed, and I think George Lucas was right, because what actually ended up happening was George Lucas ended up creating a much more meaningful, I think it's more profound, and I think actually more fulfilling and interesting character arc, a total character arc for the character of Han Solo that would not have happened if he had died, or possibly, I mean, maybe there's ways they could have done it, but I don't think it's as likely that it would have happened if he'd died in the first act of Return of the Jedi. But the key point is that Han actually had a completed character arc in the old trilogy, and then J.J. Abrams went back and destroyed that character arc, completely undermined it by taking him back to a place where he was right back at the beginning of the old trilogy. At the start of the old trilogy, Han starts as a virtueless, selfish con man. He's basically a bit of a villain. But by the end of the old trilogy, he has completed his character arc. He has been completely transformed by the events that have unfolded in that story and the characters that he has encountered, the other people in his story, and he has now become a better human being. He has flourished. He is now a self-sacrificial hero. It's actually a really good character arc. It's complete, it's total, it's just a great example of a character arc that is well done, that is well written. And what's interesting is that it's his relationship to Princess Leia that effectively is the sort of the linchpin for his character arc. She as a character is what? A personification of the rebellion. Princess Leia is the rebellion in this original trilogy. And so the relationship that Han has with Leia is really not just about the two of them, it's also a metaphor for his relationship with the rebellion. It's also a metaphor, it's symbolic of his relationship with virtue as well. He starts out selfish, he ends up self-sacrificial. He goes from a virtueless character who's all about self-gratification to a character who is practicing virtue to the ultimate level. He is willing to give of himself in total self-sacrificial ways. That's a profound shift. And you see this unfolding over the 3 films. In A New Hope, basically, he wants no part of the rebellion unless he's getting paid. His relationship with Leia is very much like that. In The Empire Strikes Back, he's starting to warm a little bit, but he still wants the relationship on his terms. Remember the very final act of that film when he's going down into the carbonite freezing machine, and there's that great line, and what a phenomenal piece of cinema. I love you. And his response is, I know. That is the response of a man who's still not willing to commit, even when he is faced with death. But there is something there that's changing in him. And you see this in the second film. There's sort of he's not quite there yet, but he's getting closer. And then what happens? Effectively, he experiences a kind of death. He goes down into the pit of death, and he is reborn, and he is reborn as a new character. And what's interesting is at the end of that film, he is now, he's in it. He's totally committed. He's in for a penny, he's in for a pound. And this is a character now who has totally given himself to not just to the cause of the rebellion, but you also see this with his relationship with Princess Leia. That personifies what's going on here. They're all quite surprised when it's announced that Han Solo is the man leading this dangerous shuttle mission to the surface of Endor. And then at the very end of the film, he has this confusion, and he doesn't realize that Leia and Luke are brother and sister. He thinks that Leia and Luke are in love. And so he is willing to actually even act in the most, I guess, meaningful self-sacrificial way. He says to her, look, do your thing, I'm happy for the both of you. And he doesn't realize that in actual fact that she has fallen in love with him. But he's willing to forego what he wants, his own self-gratification, for the sake of her happiness. Total self-giving love. It's just virtue, a shining object lesson, an example of virtue. That is not the Han Solo we met at the beginning of the old trilogy. But here's the thing. The Force Awakens completely destroyed all of that. What J.J. Abrams did is he took Han Solo all the way back to the beginning and completely destroyed a fulfilled character arc. He turns him into this rogue, criminal, virtueless smuggler who has now abandoned Leia. He has abandoned the rebellion. He has abandoned virtue. And all of this was done, I think, because he just wanted Han Solo back in the film, the way I remembered him when I was a kid. It was such a mess. I'll talk more in a minute about how I think this character could have been handled better. But for me, there was absolutely no good reason to do that. It just speaks to either laziness or some sort of pure financial utility. How do we recreate a character how he used to look in the hope that maybe, we'll put more bums on seats, sell more tickets, sell more toys, I don't know, whatever it is. But the point is that J.J. Abrams in The Force Awakens completely destroyed that character arc, and now he has gone back, and it doesn't even really make a lot of sense. Why the heck is this old guy who was like one of the heroes, the famous heroes of the defeat of the Empire, is now what, smuggling? How the heck could he even be a smuggler? This doesn't really make a lot of sense. He's going to be this low-key smuggler that he's going to go all around the galaxy and no one's going to really know that it's him. None of this makes any sense. This was dumb. It wasn't even well put. Like, even if you wanted to do that as your story point, why did The Force Awakens not give us actually a coherent little timeline or something as to how he ended up becoming so jaded and leaving Leia and going back into this lifestyle? It's really stark. He's gone from being one thing to another thing. And again, this is the irony, because this was the big problem with Luke Skywalker. It's this character who has gone through this complete 180-degree sort of cataclysmic shift. They are now something totally different to what they were at the end of the old trilogy, and there's no real sound explanation, no rational explanation for why this would have happened. The fourth and final problem with The Force Awakens was the fact that it was a woefully inferior rip-off of A New Hope, the first Star Wars film that kicked this whole magical adventure off. And what J.J. Abrams did, I think, was probably the most creatively, or one of the most creatively bankrupt moments in the whole new trilogy for me, was that there was no creative vision. They could not think outside the box. There was no way for them to actually think beyond the bounds of going, let's just take the original film and we'll rip that off and we'll add a few new elements in there, but we will create a film that is almost identical in story to the very first Star Wars film. It's almost a direct rip-off. And actually the way it was done really doesn't even make any sense when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Like, for example, what the heck is the Resistance? Why do you have this world now in which you've got a new republic, the Empire's been defeated, but then you've got like this third militia that's operating under its own authority? What is that? How does that even make sense? It doesn't make sense. And there's no rational explanation for why that is the way that it is. Now, I had Matthew Kadish on my YouTube channel a couple of videos ago. If you haven't seen that video, go and watch it. And I really loved one of the recommendations that he made, was that perhaps the Resistance should have actually been some sort of special forces unit within the New Republic, and as things began to collapse, they ended up becoming the New Resistance because they were the only ones that were sort of left to actually fight the battle. That would have made a lot of sense. But the point is, the way the story happens just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Going back and retelling the original story now isn't just creatively bankrupt, it's just dumb. Because the events, the story, the characters, the universe, everything has progressed. And so to take it all the way back and just regress doesn't make any sense. How the heck did the First Order actually manage to build a super weapon as the remnants of a defeated empire? Where did they get the money? How did they build that with no one noticing? How did they build this thing, this ultimate weapon? They're more powerful now than the people that actually that got defeated. They're more powerful than the empire was, and that was the group that was defeated by the rebels. How has this come about? How does no one know that this is happening? If you go back to the old trilogy, there's spies everywhere, the rebellion knows what's going on. No one knew this was happening. The Force Awakens basically kicked off this new trilogy from a place of total creative bankruptcy, a lack of creative vision and originality. They just ripped off wholesale what had gone before. They just plagiarized it and added in a few new characters. And the characters they have added in have not added anything. They've only detracted from the original story concept that we got in A New Hope. And it doesn't make any sense. Why did this happen? Well, I get the feeling when I think about new Star Wars, this sort of feels like a production and a process that has been governed by two things that are equally flawed and dangerous if you're going to be creative. The two things are fear and utilitarianism. So utilitarianism, first of all, I think that the bean counters behind this new production said, we've got to maximize our profits, we've got to make money, just go back and look at the old trilogy. You know, what do the kids love in the old trilogy? They love a bit of the old Darth Vader. So make sure you got a masked villain, a black guy, and somehow, you know, let's shoehorn in a bit of Vader into the story. They love the Death Star blowing up. You know, do a big super weapon it's a planet and it blows up. It sort of feels like pure sort of utility that you just pluck concepts out of the air and stick them into a story because you think they've worked before, and it seems that probably it would be financial utility that was driving this. The other thing I think that happened here was fear. I think that they were deathly afraid of stuffing things up like the prequels stuffed things up. Now, to give George Lucas his credit, at least he didn't rip off his own original stories and then just retell them. He did try to bring something new. And even if the execution was flawed, he did try to do that. This new trilogy has just ripped off existing material. It's just plagiarized it wholesale. And I think the reason that happened was because they were petrified of ending up with a prequels type outcome, which is kind of ironic because they've now ended up with something far worse, I would argue. They've got a situation where they've effectively divided the fan base into a bitter division. And I'm not convinced that episode 9 is actually going to be that big a success. There's certainly no hype and interest in it from I would argue, a big chunk of the fan base. Potential new fans, what are you selling to them? Not really anything that's that magical or engaging as a piece of mythology or storytelling. They've actually done worse. But I think the reason this happened was because they were so desperately scared of actually creating a prequels mistake that they thought, let's just go back and sort of imitate what came before, because they love that. You know, they will love us. If we give the people what they want, they will love us. And the problem was, it was just creatively bankrupt. And as I said, not only that, but it's actually made the situation worse. And here's the thing, there was absolutely no need for this, which brings me to my final point. What could The Force Awakens actually have been? Well, for me, the name says it all, and it's actually quite a clever name, but the way they chose to apply it and to, I guess, outwork that concept of the Force awakening in this story was a hot mess. But what you've got is, the key here is awakens. That's the key. Basically, I think what they should have done was have this idea of the Force being dormant, because the Force is not needed. Basically, peace has come to the galaxy. After the events of Return of the Jedi, sure, there are a few last battles, but the Empire has been routed, or so it seems. And peace has finally come to the galaxy. And I think Han and Leia now should have been retired generals at this point, when we caught up with them at the start of The Force Awakens. I think Leia could have been a politician now, so she's in a senior leadership role that is appropriate to her age as a character. Han and Chewie, I think, could have been something like perhaps retired generals who now train military personnel, but they are guys in the twilight of their characters. Han and Leia still would have been together, but they would have had no children in my version of The Force Awakens, and this would have been a point of great sadness for them. It would have been something that really is still with them and they still carry with them, and it gives them something. It's a new development, but it gives us a way to connect to these characters in a new and mature kind of way, without going to this sort of bizarre and sort of absurd levels, like, you know, let's give them a divorce, and let's have Luke, as the cynical, jaded, awful of a character. But here's a way to do that, so that we can sort of see a maturity in these characters, something different, something new, but it still draws us in, and we love these characters, and so we feel their sadness and their pain. We're sort of drawn into their story. Luke, in the meantime, is a character who is in retirement. The Jedi are no longer needed, because peace has come and stability has come to the galaxy, and so he's no longer training Jedis. Instead, what you've got is a character of Luke who's kind of like a bit of a historian, a bit of a theologian or philosopher, who basically people come to learn about the Jedis from him. He's teaching, spacecrafts full of school children about the history of the Jedis and how important they are. People might come and study and learn the history, but there's no actual training. Of a historian, a bit of a theologian or philosopher, who basically people come to learn about the Jedis from him. He's teaching, spacecrafts full of school children about the history of the Jedis and how important they are. People might come and study and learn the history, but there's no actual training of Jedi Knights anymore, because apparently that's not needed. Peace has come to the galaxy. And then all of a sudden one day, Obi-Wan appears in a dream to Luke, and it's very, very vivid, and it's sort of startling, and it shocks him out of a place of, I guess, complacency, where he thinks all is well in the galaxy. And Obi-Wan tells him that there is a Force-sensitive girl, a very, very powerful Force-sensitive young girl on the planet of Jakku, and he needs to go there immediately to track her down and bring her to safety, and he needs to start training her as a Jedi Knight. It's hugely important that he does this. And so this is what's kicking off this whole idea of awakening. So you've got dormancy in the Force, because it's not needed. There's peace in the galaxy, but suddenly there's rumblings. Something's not quite right. And so this film is about the unfolding of that old, I guess, new order of peace into chaos again. But the idea of the awakening is that we start in a place where we don't have effectively a brand new version of the Empire and everything's still at war. There's peace. Now, when we meet the character of Rey, she is exactly as she should be. She is very rough around the edges, which is what this character should be. She's kind of like, or she should be kind of like Sarah Connor in Terminator 2, who is cynical, who's jaded. She has a purpose about her, and she has a well-developed character, but she's cynical and jaded about the world because the world has not been kind to her. And so that's what Rey should actually be like. And Luke is kind of hesitant. She looks at Luke as this old fellow, and she's suspicious of his motives. She's cynical. She's a bit of a thief, basically. She is, in many ways, a bit of a villain herself. She lacks virtue because no one's trained her how to be virtuous. She's someone who has been let down by life, and that shows in her character. But eventually, with the promise of a better life, and that's the only reason she leaves, because in actual fact, she's desperate to get out of this mess, Luke takes her off Jakku, and he takes her to Han and Leia, who effectively all but adopt her. And so you sort of have this thing with their desperate desire and this great sadness they had about not being able to have a child. Now perhaps something's being fulfilled here for them, and so they take her in. Meanwhile, in the story, what else is going on is you've got this political faction that's happening within this new peaceful galaxy that is being led by a young, charismatic politician who's a former military veteran, and his name is Kylo Ren. He is not the son of Leia and Han. He is not another Skywalker. He's not another Solo. He is a completely different character, and he is gaining in popularity. People like this guy because he seems to be pointing out some of the problems that are happening in the galaxy. Basically, you've got peace in the galaxy, but what you've also got is a situation whereby bureaucracy has taken over, and that bureaucracy is starting to become fat. That bureaucracy is starting to cause problems. It's actually starting to be rife with corruption, mishandling of resources. And what you've got is some systems, planets, peoples are starting to be marginalised by this. They're missing out. They're being treated badly. And he's offering a supposed way forward, a new and better way to do things. But Leia sees the danger here. She understands what others can't see, that there's more going on here potentially, or that what this guy is proposing is actually a path to dictatorship. When you create a cult of personality around a strong man, you end up with problems. And so she's sort of the only one who really sees the danger. Now, the other thing about Kylo Ren is that he is also a character, we don't know this initially, but we discover he's actually obsessed with Darth Vader. In fact, he has kind of a cult of Darth Vader. He has this cult-like worship of Vader and of the Empire, because it turns out in secret that the private face of Kylo Ren is that in actual fact, he wants to restore the old order, and he wants an empire, and he wants more of the strong-arm control of the galaxy. And because of his own events, and what you do with that character is you would give him a childhood and events that happened in his life that would make sense and would justify all of this. He would have been someone who grew up on one of those systems that has been badly affected by the problems with this new bureaucracy. And perhaps even his parents, his family was harmed in such a major way by all of this that he now is angry at the way things are, at the established order. Effectively, we've seen this in our human history, so we'd relate to this quite easily. He's a dangerous revolutionary who doesn't seem to be dangerous because people are in need and they are desperate, and they're sort of looking to anything to try and solve the problem. What we don't know, though, is that Kylo Ren has actually got together with some of those disenfranchised systems, and effectively he has convinced them to fund the formation of an army so that they can mount a military coup and take over, and in their minds save the galaxy from itself. I think he should be more of a Thanos type character in that sense, that his motivations are villainous, they are evil, but they're also a little bit complicated in that he's reacting to things. This is how you can have a villain that's clear-cut, but also have a bit of maturity to that as well. You know, it's not just sort of black and white. There's also the fact that he is reacting to the way that the new order has failed people within the galaxy. The problem is that his solution is not the right one. It's quite evil, in fact. Meanwhile, so in the outer reaches, he's basically prepared himself an army for a military coup, and it's been, as I said, secretly funded by these disenfranchised systems who feel that the Republic has treated them badly. Then, on a peaceful, sunny day, the attack begins, and you have a military coup, an invasion of key targets that happens. And what have you got now? You've got a situation where the Republic is no longer prepared for war. They've got a military that's basically little more than a peacekeeping force. They haven't funded the military for war. They haven't funded them for major defensive efforts. They haven't been trained for that purpose. They are effectively little more than sort of like a basically trained, glorified police force, and they are totally out of their depth. They're not well resourced, they're not well trained, and they are overwhelmed by this focused, trained, and well-equipped military force that targets them for invasion, military coup, takeover, to bring about a new and peaceful and better version of the galaxy. And what happens is that Han and Leia, in their attempts to try and get Rey to safety, they end up being killed. And they desperately know they've got to keep her away. That's one thing they know about her as a character. And they know from their own experiences, this powerful Force user cannot be united with Kylo Ren. And so maybe not both Han and Leia, but at least Han, I think his character would die, and it would be a self-sacrificial death that he would die. It would have meaning, and he wouldn't have become some dodgy old smuggler again. He's now developed and progressed as a character, and it's like this self-sacrificial character has now grown and matured as well, and you give him a final send-off that's fitting to him as a character. Luke faces down with Kylo, but he loses. He is a Jedi who has not been training as a Jedi Knight, and even though he is powerful, Kylo Ren is much more focused in his training, and he is prepared, and Luke is bested for whatever reason, even if you want to give him a bit of an Achilles heel or cripple him in some way so that there's an advantage to Kylo. That's what happens, and Luke loses, and he's forced to flee. Han and Leia, as I said, are now dead, or at least Han is. They're killed by Kylo's forces. Rey flees in terror. That's all she knows how to do. Her whole life is about self-preservation, because this is how she's been brought up. So what does she do? She flees in terror for her life. And so she's now on the run at the end of this film. We don't know where she is. The Republic forces, they're little more than peacekeeping forces, they are decimated. And the military personnel who are alive are forced into hiding, and now you have something that's ready for the beginning of the resistance. Now see what you've got there, I think, is like the idea of the Force Awakens. It's gone from peacetime to something awakening. So the first film basically would tell the fall of the Republic and the rise of the First Order. The First Order are not this magical super army who are just there. We've given you an explanation for where that all came from. And you have, like the twilight, the setting sun on something that's gone before. And I think that would be a much more meaningful and interesting story. Then in the second film, what you have is a period of struggle under the First Order. You have now the formation of the Resistance, and you have Luke and a new heroic leader, maybe a Finn or a Poe. You have, you can still have that idea of a stormtrooper or someone who's on the side of Kylo Ren's armies, who's disenfranchised by it all, who was never quite convinced and decides to lead, and he becomes an important character in all of this. Luke and Kylo are now both desperately searching for Rey. That's sort of one of the big drivers of the second film, is the hunt for Rey, because they know how important she is. Luke finds her first, and Rey is then partially trained by Luke. But Luke is discovered by Kylo Ren before he can complete the training. And he, not Rey, not like Empire, Luke is forced to go into battle with Kylo Ren, but he is defeated and he is killed at that point. He is given, again, a meaningful end to a character who has, that we've had a profound investment in up until this point. And then Rey at that point is taken captive, and now you got the end of the second film where it looks like now Kylo Ren, the First Order, have total ascendancy, and who the heck is left to defeat them? They've got all the goodies, and there's no one there apart from a sort of ragtag resistance, if you like, but there's no Jedi Knight to lead them. Then comes the third film, and in the third film what we have is a new Jedi who emerges from hiding. And what we discover in that third film is that this new Jedi was trained by Luke in secret for this moment. It wasn't just the dream he had about Rey, but he also had premonitions, and it was very clear to him that he had to train a new Jedi Knight. And so he trains this one Jedi Knight and has been training him for years for this very moment. And so this Jedi Knight now comes out of hiding, comes into the picture, and has to track down and rescue Rey. And so this is part of the story, convincing Rey to leave, to come with him, to complete that aspect of the training. And then you build up to this final battle between the Resistance and the First Order. And what you have is that Rey and this new Jedi, they both have to team up in order to defeat Kylo Ren, because he's become that powerful. They have to face him together. And of course it would end in true heroic Star Wars fashion, with the demise of the bad guys and the good guys winning their virtue wins and defeated. To me, that would have been a far better way. Now, I don't profess to be a super duper screenwriter. I don't profess to have all the answers, and there's plenty of blanks that would need to be filled in, but for me, I think that would have been far better than the creatively bankrupt version of events that we were served up. And you can't blame Rian Johnson for this. This started with The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens served us up a creatively bankrupt film to start a trilogy that is now a mess. As per usual, started with The Force Awakens. The Force Awakens served us up a creatively bankrupt film to start a trilogy that is now a mess. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how to do that are found in the video description below. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media. Thanks for watching. Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode what I thought I'd do is I would talk about three favourite films of mine that I think are criminally underrated. Now, what do I mean by criminally underrated? These are films that when I tell people about them, or I talk to people about them, I have people saying one of two things as their most common reaction. They either say, "Oh, I'd never heard about that film, tell me more," or they will say to me, "Oh yeah, that film, I'd totally forgotten about that." They are films that just didn't make such a big splash at the very beginning, that they never really stuck in the public consciousness. They're not sort of at the forefront of your mind when you think about big sort of memorable type movies, and I think they deserve to be more, they're criminally underrated, and they actually deserve more attention than they get today, and certainly than they actually got at the time that they were released. The first of these films comes from 2009. This is not in chronological order, by the way, but from 2009, it's Knowing. Now, I should say before we go any further, just be aware there are going to be spoilers. So if you haven't seen Knowing and you don't want anything spoiled, go away, watch the film, and then come back later and watch this video. So Knowing is the 2009 film directed by Alex Proyas. Apologies if I am pronouncing his name wrong, the Alex Proyas fan club. It's quite possible I'm pronouncing his last name wrong. But he is also known for films like The Crow, which obviously is a lot more well known, and Dark City, which is another, interestingly enough, is another criminally underrated film. It's not on my list today, but you know, it's not often you have a director who has two criminally underrated films, but Dark City is another one of his as well. Stars Nicolas Cage, Ben Mendelsohn, who's now a lot more well known, but this was sort of one of his first bigger sort of crossover roles into the world of big Hollywood. Marco Beltrami does the score. Marco Beltrami, as per usual, the score is just great. He's a great composer, and he's great whenever he is involved in composing for a film. There's just something about his scores that just add that little bit extra, and there's no exception in this film. It's a really great score. One of the things I really like about this film is the use of light. And there's some really... This is a very visually striking film at times. There's some really great visuals that sort of... They speak to something that really is like a time before 2009 movies, or movies that were made in the 2000s. It sort of speaks to visuals that you might have been used to seeing in a 1980s film or even earlier. And it's really, a lot of this is around the use of light, but also the use of darkness. Now, you don't really use darkness. You manipulate light. But what you have here is you manipulate that light to achieve an effect with light and dark in your shot composition. So you don't manipulate the darkness so much as you actually manipulate the light, and you move the darkness around, if you like, within that shot. But darkness is a big part of this. So the use of darkness, lighting in conjunction with darkness, it makes for a really visually engaging film, and some really great and I think very memorable visuals. That for me, that's one of the great aspects of this film. But it's not just the visuals. Obviously, there's also a great story as well. You'll also notice things like even just the way, not just lighting is used, but other visual aspects. So for example, basically at the very start of the film, when the events of our era kick off, we're in autumn, and you have these we're deep into autumn. The autumn leaves are falling. It's the final stages of autumn. You see this with the lighting, and there's this constant stream of falling leaves and foliage. They permeate and saturate just about every shot. Now, that's quite an important visual cue, because it's actually very cleverly speaking to what's going on in the story. And the story is about really the autumn time of the earth. Autumn is what? It's symbolic of the end of a season, and this is a film about the end of the season of life on earth. It's coming to an end. The springtime is over, the summertime is over, things are now dying, and that's what this film is about. It's about a dying earth, and so that visual is really important. It actually speaks to the story, and it's a very, very clever visual. The story is engaging. I think the characters are interesting. It's well acted. Nicolas Cage in this film is really well directed. I think this is actually a great Nicolas Cage acting performance. There's what you might call moments of very brief little moments of Nick Cage flourishing, where he does his little Nick Cage flourishes, but they are few and far between, and it's quite almost a reserved acting performance where it's appropriate to the character and to what's going on. It's what I would call harnessed Nicolas Cage intensity, not just rampant and wild, out of control Nicolas Cage intensity. And clearly, it seems he's being really well directed in this film, and his performance is great. There are a lot of similarities between this movie and the M. Night Shyamalan film Signs. You've got a dead wife and mother who is central to sort of the plot and the characters and what they're experiencing. Questions around faith and meaning are a big part of both films. Aliens are a big part of both films, and of course the whole theme of prophecy, these prophetic ideas about the future, prophetic utterances about the future, and so that these things are, both of these films, that they're very big themes for both films, and they have a lot in common. Obviously they are very different too in the plot and what's actually going on. This is a film that I think still holds up. One thing for me personally is that I think thrillers have a bit of a shelf life, because thrillers rely on the thrill, and the thrill comes from the unknown, the uncertainty, and once you know what the twist is, once you know what the big reveal is, the thrill is generally gone. And so for me, I find that thrillers have a very limited shelf life. There's not a lot of thrillers that hold up. This film still holds up. I still watch this film. I've watched it over and over and over again, and I still enjoy watching this film because it's so well crafted, and there's more going on in this movie. The story is good, the acting is good, the characters are interesting, the visuals are awesome, the score is great. So what it means is that even though you know the plot already, you know the outcome, you know what the reveal is, you know what the twist is, none of that matters. It's still a really good, enjoyable, and engaging film to watch. You can still watch it and actually enjoy it and get something out of it. And I think one of the moments that really sort of typifies this for me is that plane crash scene, which is, once again, another great visual. But that plane crash scene, like, I've seen the movie a lot of times. I know it's coming, but still, it still impacts you. It still, for me, is a really engaging scene. I'm still caught up in that scene. There's a lot like that in this film, where even though you know the plot and you know what's going to happen, you are still caught up and taken along for the ride, the thrill ride of what's going on and what's unfolding. And that, to me, is the sign of a great film, because it starts, interestingly enough, it starts in a place where you think it's kind of a small-scale thriller, sort of horror thing. But then by the end of it, it's become this grand sci-fi epic. And it just, as the film grows in scope, it's sort of like it starts very narrowly defined, very small couple of characters in a very small, tight-knit community and situation. And then it sort of starts unfolding and growing outwards, and the scope of what's going on gets bigger, and the thrills get bigger, and all that sort of stuff. And it's really engaging, and you go on that journey, and you still go on that journey each time you watch it. And that's the mark of a good film, because it still takes you on a journey, even though you know what the outcome is going to be, and you still enjoy going on that journey. Has it got its weaknesses? Sure. It's not a perfect film. It's not a masterpiece of cinematic filmmaking, but it is a good film. It still holds up, and there's lots about this film to really, really like. So the question remains, why is Knowing so criminally underrated? Why is this not a film that's really stuck in the public consciousness? Because it actually is a good film. It holds up, it's well made, it's a great and enjoyable film. Why hasn't it stuck? Well, I think when you look at what else was released in 2009, it becomes pretty clear exactly what happened that year and why Knowing just got sort of pushed to the bottom of the food chain and didn't attract the same level of hype and attention, and didn't stick in the public consciousness as a result. And these are just some of the just some, and there was other really big name films that came out that year. Inglourious Bastards, Watchmen, Avatar. We'll come back to Avatar because Avatar is important. Star Trek, so a much beloved franchise, is undergoing this brand new and exciting reboot, and that happens the same year. Zombieland, District 9, this new breakthrough sci-fi film. Sherlock Holmes, big popular actor at the pinnacle of his career, a new reboot of Sherlock Holmes, plus it's got a new spin on it. That comes out that year. The Road, which is a post-apocalyptic movie. 2012, which is also an apocalyptic movie, and it's about an apocalypse happening to the Earth. And it was big. It had a much bigger budget, and there's a lot more marketing around that, so it's kind of not surprising that, perhaps that corner of the market was already well and truly sealed up by the time Knowing comes out a bit later in the year. And then Fast and Furious, which is another big franchise that, had huge popular appeal. The big one there, though, I think, is Avatar. And what you've got with Avatar, and this is a bit of a consistent theme for me, at least one other film that is in this criminally underrated category here in this video today also is up against it in this regard, is that Avatar isn't just a film that's got a lot of hype. Avatar is a film that's considered a game changer in the history of cinema. It's like, this film hasn't just got the usual hype, yeah, go and see this film, it's amazing, but this film is doing something new with cinema. So in the same year as you've got this big breakthrough cinematic event like Avatar happening, you got a film like Knowing, along with all of those other things that it's competing with. And so it's not really surprising that it didn't stick in the public consciousness, but it's well worth watching. And if you want to have a good, enjoyable sci-fi thriller experience, go and watch Knowing. Now, the second of my three criminally underrated films, I don't actually have a case to hold up and show you, because for some reason, someone has either borrowed or acquired without permission, shall we say, my copy of this movie, so I can't hold up the case to show you, but it's the 2002 film Equilibrium. Now, Equilibrium is a film that is a combination of things like Brave New World, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, and of course, there's a little bit of The Matrix in there as well. The Matrix is a thing here, and you can definitely see the influence of The Matrix and the style of The Matrix. This is a film about a future world where they have brought peace, quote unquote, to the world, and people live in this new state of peace by taking drugs that actually limit human emotion. They have outlawed art. They have outlawed things that are beautiful, things that are colourful, anything that can stir up human emotion. So basically, this is a world without free will. This is a pure world of pure utilitarianism, where everything is about function and no emotion and no beauty, and none of those sort of concepts really matter, because they believe that if you allow emotion and beauty that provokes emotion and things like that, then what you end up with is the human passions get evoked, and that leads to war and violence and crime. So we live in this world now where we've achieved peace, and the way we've achieved peace is by anyone who actually possesses works of art or beauty and music and things that are colourful, and who doesn't take their drug to keep their emotions in check, they're a criminal, and they can be executed. They are what is known as euphemistically a sense offender in this world, and they're executed. So this world of peace is actually a world of violence. It's a lie. Now, there's lots of parallels that can be drawn around things like communism, but there's also some deeper stuff going on here. Again, like Knowing, this is a film that I think is very visually striking. Unlike Knowing, this is a film that's working with a budget, but it maximizes, I think, that budget really, really well in what it does. And I've got a lot of respect for this film in the way in which it takes its budget, which is clearly limited, and uses it, relatively well to convey the sense of this world. And the sterility of this world is very much an ever-present reality in the visuals of this film. Everything is cold, hard, and sterile. And you know what that's a reflection of? The relationships between every other person, between persons who live in this world. They live in a cold, sterile world, including the way they relate to each other. Even things like objects down to like clipboards, pen and paper, these sterile, cold sort of aluminium or metal clipboard cases that they have documents in. The way they arrange their desks is not based on personal preference and what I like. It's about function, maximizing utility. Even the way they speak to each other, it's not just the fact that they speak to each other without emotion in this world, it's also the language and the words they use, and the way they speak is also clinical. It's not just that they are emotionless in what they are saying, it's the fact that they only say words because they're trying to achieve a utilitarian purpose. They're there, it's solely for the function, for the utility of those words. I tell you things not based on making polite chit chat and conversation, because that's not what we do in this world. Instead, this is about having conversations, or about basically me giving you data or getting data in response from you. That's it. It's just so clinical. And in that way, what this film speaks to is really quite profound. And this film always reminds me about Aristotle, the greatest of the Greek philosophers, and Aristotle's ethics, and where he talks in particular about friendship and human relationships. And basically he identifies that there's only ever three possible types of relationships that human beings can ever have with each other. The first and the lowest level of relating is what he calls a friendship of utility. And this is a relationship that only exists between two people because there is some utility in it for both of them. So let's say, for example, you're a builder and you build houses, and I sell building products. Well, I need to make money, you need to make money. You're a builder, so you can buy my building products and that gets me money. You're a builder, you need the building products I have to build houses and sell them and make money. So our relationship exists solely based on this utility, money and building products that exist between us. But let's say a couple of years into our relationship, I start selling beauty products instead of building products, but that's no good to you because you can't build houses with beauty products, and I can't sell my beauty products to you because you're not interested in them, and so our relationship basically comes to a very quick end. That's because the relationship between us was built on nothing more than utility, what we were both getting out of it. The next level of friendship is what Aristotle called a pleasurable friendship, or a friendship of pleasure. Now this is a bit different. It's not just about utility. It's about the enjoyment that we take from being with each other, the pleasure that we take from being in the company of this other person, just hanging out and doing stuff with them. But there's a third and higher form of friendship still, and it's what Aristotle called a friendship of virtue. And in a friendship of virtue, it's now no longer about what I get out of the relationship. It's about seeking the good of this other person, self-giving, self-sacrificing, sacrificial love for this other person for their own benefit, for their own good. And what's really important about a friendship of virtue is that it's not just good for the person who's on the receiving end of that self-giving friendship. It's also really good for me as a human person, because it's how I flourish and how I find full and deep meaning in life is through self-giving friendship. And this film always reminds me about Aristotle and his ethics and his philosophy around friendship and human relationships. Why? Because the relationships in this film, they do not exist for the good of the other person. They don't even exist person to person. They are totally dehumanized relationships. These relationships between the people in this world only exist to serve the ideology. They are totally dehumanized. There is absolutely no connection between these persons. The only reason they communicate and they are in connection with each other is because they are all at service of this ideology. They are part of the collective. You see this really clearly expressed between the character of Preston, played by Christian Bale, who's the main character in this, and his children. The way the children talk to their father and vice versa, and the way marriage is portrayed in this world. Again, the primary focus of their relationships is not the other person, and it's not about human connection. It's the ideology, which has inserted itself into their humanity and has destroyed their humanity. As I said, this is a film that's made on a budget, but it punched well above its weight, I think, this film. It uses its budget to maximum effect. And it just, like, there's really, interesting enough, there's some profound things in this film. It doesn't go deep, and it's not a great treatise on these issues, but it's an action film that sort of defies the genre, or punches above its weight in that regard, and it raises these interesting ideas, and it puts us in that mode of thinking more than just action movie, action happening, character, good guy, bad guy, fighting, sword fight, gunfight. It's more than that. There's a whole purpose to the action, and the purpose is really about defeating this evil ideology and also exploring what's wrong with this evil ideology and why it should be defeated. And there's this. It's interesting. Really, this film is in many ways is almost it's like a prophetic warning in some ways about elements of postmodernism that have captured our culture, or certainly popular culture. There's a scene, a very brief snippet we see of Father, who is like the great moral leader of the society, who we discover at the end of the film is not really who he claims to be anyway, but everyone's watching. They're constantly watching and being educated and re-educated by Father on these video screens. And there's a brief scene you see with Preston's son watching Father, and it's just a snippet, but he's talking about how the idea of the hate crime was actually an important development. And then the sort of the TV switches off, or the sound goes off, and so we don't hear the rest of it. But that's very much something that is with us today. The whole idea of euphemism and the way they refer to people, they call them sense offenders. Now that sounds awful, but when you think about what is a sense offender, well, a sense offender is someone who engages with objects of art and of great beauty, and they are touched and moved by those things, and they are moved by human emotion. That's not an offensive thing, but the euphemism makes it an offensive thing. And basically what you've got is the society of people where they are totally numb to the lies and the evil that is being perpetrated and that they are perpetrating. So Christian Bale's character really goes on this journey of realizing, and he comes to the fullness of this conclusion, that he's actually perpetrating a great evil. And the way they're able to distance themselves from that is because they have dehumanized their victims. And the use of euphemism is the way to dehumanize your victims. And that's a real important warning, I think, for us today, because in the political discourse, there is a lot of dehumanization that goes on. And that's a real big problem, because dehumanization actually gives us permission to treat people in ways that are dehumanized. And to if we don't see and recognize their personhood, then that effectively gives us, even if it's only tacit permission, it gives us permission to treat people in dehumanized ways. And to treat people in ways that are not humane. And so in this film we see a lot of that idea as very much front and center. But ultimately what we also discover is that this is a world that's not about principle either. it's not a principled world. It's about pure power. Because we discover this as we go through the film. So this isn't a world that has built some false ideology where they've stripped out truth, goodness, and beauty. And by the way, because they don't have truth, and they don't recognize beauty for what it is, and they don't have goodness. In fact, they're lying to themselves. They claim to be in a world of peace, but they're actually murdering. They're just wholesale murdering people simply for looking at works of art or listening to pieces of music. That is not a world of peace. That is not a world of goodness. That is not a utopia. But it looks good from the outside because, hey, good news, we haven't had a war and we haven't had any crimes. That's because the government is actually committing all the crimes to ensure that no crimes get committed. The whole thing is a lie, but you realise, as I said pretty quickly, that this is about pure power. It's not a principle at all, because we find this out when we get to the end of the film, that in actual fact, Father, or DuPont, who's actually really is Father now because Father doesn't exist anymore, that he's a hypocrite. We discover when we go into his penthouse office at the very end of the film, what do we see when Preston is in there? This colourful room with works of art in it. He's a sense offender himself, but it's okay for him because I guess some people are more equal than others, basically. There's no principle here, it's pure power. And you often see that with a lot of these ideologies. They're not principled ideologies, it's purely about power and dominance of one group over another. And they will claim that dominance and power and unjust treatment of another group is all about some principle, but in actual fact it's not. And you can see the inconsistency really clearly in this film. One of the things I like about this film is that where the crescendo of the film actually lies. Usually when you think about a film like this, particularly an action film, the crescendo of the film is at the sort of the final action set piece, the defeat of the evil, the overcoming of evil, the defeating of the bad guys. But that's not actually where the crescendo of this film lies. And we see this, or should I say we hear this, I think, more clearly with the musical cues that the score gives us. It's actually the execution of Mary O'Brien, which is really the crescendo of this film. The music builds to that moment, and it's this overwhelming emotional swell in the musical cue there that's different to anywhere else in the film. And it's the big moment where the conversion, shall we say, of Preston, of Christian Bale's character, is complete. The scales have finally fallen totally off his eyes, and it's her death, the death of this innocent woman, this good woman, that in actual fact is the crescendo. And it's once that happens, and once, because Christian Bale in this film, he's a representative of the whole system. He is a grammaton cleric. He is the pinnacle. He is the brightest of them. He's the greatest of them. And he is a representative of the very system itself. So once the character who is the representation, the embodiment, the personification of the system has had his conversion and the scales have fallen off, that's a metaphor for effectively the fact that this system will not succeed. It will not last. It is only a matter of time before it is destroyed. Because if the greatest of the great from within the ideology and the regime itself can come to the truth, then it's game over at that point for the regime. And that's what we see in that moment. That's why it's the crescendo. The death of Mary O'Brien, it is the crescendo. It's this vile act of evil. It's this moment of conversion. It's this profound moment where it's all over. And everything that happens after that, because there is a little bit more that happens after that in the sort of the final action set pieces and the total, I guess, obliteration of the regime and all their mechanisms. But those things are really, they're not an afterthought, but they're just sort of like a natural, for me when I look at the story, they're like a natural progression, but they only happen because of that event. They're just a natural outcome, but the main event, the main crescendo, is that particular moment. It's not what comes afterwards, which I find really interesting. And as I said, when we get to the final moment, we discover anyway the whole hypocrisy of this ideology, and DuPont, Father, quote unquote, is actually a hypocrite. And he spells this out really clearly. Not only do we see this when we look around this lavish room with this colour and works of art in it, but also we realise when he makes that mocking comment to Christian Bale's character Preston, when he says, tread carefully, for you tread on my dreams. He's quoting the poet Yeats there, and that's important because that piece of poetry, that line from the poetry, is uttered by Sean Bean's character at the very beginning of the film. And it can be easy to sort of miss that quote. That quote is not just him mocking character, for you tread. We realise when he makes that mocking comment to Christian Bale's character Preston when he says, tread carefully, for you tread on my dreams. He's quoting the poet Yeats there, and that's important because that piece of poetry, that line from the poetry, is uttered by Sean Bean's character at the very beginning of the film, and that's, it can be easy to sort of miss that quote. That quote is not just him mocking Preston, DuPont mocking Preston, because he shot and killed his friend, executed his friend after his friend had delivered that line of poetry to him. But it's really effectively him sort of wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, I'm a sense offender, effectively. You look around you. It's really quite a clever little indication of the grand hypocrisy of all this, and the fact that this is all about power and not principle. So as I said, this is a film that I think really punches above its weight. It's not your typical sort of sci-fi type action movie. It actually has something profound, and I think actually when I look back now, there's a lot about this film that's prophetic and which should serve as a bit of a warning to us, whether it be about the dehumanization of persons, whether it be about the euphemisms and lies, about the postmodernism, the lack of principle, about raw power and forcing people to do all those do things that you want them to do in order to build the brave new world. So again, why is Equilibrium a film just like Knowing that failed to stick and cement itself in the public consciousness? And so today it's one of those films where you still meet people who say, oh, I've never heard of that film, or oh yeah, that's right, that film. Well, again, if you look at what else was released that year, 2002, it makes for some interesting reading. I think this film also has an issue with marketing. I know that in New Zealand here, I'm pretty sure this film did not get a cinematic release. It's something that went straight to DVD. Now, usually that's not a good sign, but in this case, this was a great film that sort of snuck its way under the radar a little bit, and almost certainly didn't have the same marketing budget that other movies might do. It's not a big budget Hollywood sort of blockbuster. But also, when you look at what else was released that year, there's some big films. You've got The Two Towers. That's right, the second film in the hugely anticipated and watched trilogy, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. So you're competing with that same year. You've got Die Another Day. You've got a James Bond movie. So the Bond franchise is putting a film out. You have got Signs, which is, M. Night Shyamalan is still on the up and up at this stage. And so Signs was a much anticipated film, and there's a lot of hype going into that movie, and a lot of people waiting for it. You have got Attack of the Clones. You've got a Star Wars film, the second film in the prequel trilogy. So you have got two major cinematic trilogies releasing their second film that same year. And then lastly, and this is kind of interesting, you've got another, it's a lower budget film, but you've got Reign of Fire that comes out that same year. Now, why is that interesting? Because Christian Bale, who is in Equilibrium, is also the lead character in Reign of Fire. So you've got this actor who's got two films that are released in 1 year, and I can't help but sense that possibly also has a bit of an impact on Equilibrium as well. But when you look at this year and combine it with the fact that it didn't have the same marketing budget to work with, this film was really up against it. The Two Towers and Attack of the Clones in the same year, plus, and by the way, that's just some of the big budget, the big cinematic releases that happened that year, but you can see why a film like this that comes towards the end of the year is sort of going to really play not just second, but probably third and fourth fiddle. There's just, everyone's going to be focused, and certainly all the critics are anticipating The Two Towers and Attack of the Clones, and that's all they're going to be talking about. And so it's easy for a film like this to get lost in the midst of that milieu where everyone is focused on big budget cinematic franchise films that are putting out their second movie that year. The third and final of my criminally underrated films is The 13th Warrior. Now, The 13th Warrior is a film that comes out in 1999, so we're really going backwards in time here. We're talking almost 20 years ago now. This is a film that's based on a Michael Crichton book called Eaters of the Dead, and it's really up against it. We'll talk about what this film was up against and why I don't think it's stuck in the public consciousness as much as other films. But I love this film. This film still holds up. And I don't think you can say that about a lot of films from the 90s, but this film really does hold up. John McTiernan directed this film, and we know that John McTiernan is a guy who has a penchant for action directing, and he's good at it, and he produces memorable action movies, and this one is no exception. It's based on some great source material, Michael Crichton, who knows how to write a good thriller. You've got a Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack that just adds something special to this film. In many ways, this sort of feels like a film from another era, and definitely the soundtrack is part of that. It feels like a film that actually could have been made in the 1980s. It's certainly got that John McTiernan 1980s action sensibility to it. But also the soundtrack's part of that, or possibly even earlier. It's got this sort of it actually looks and sounds like a big epic, but it's not made on the big, or certainly doesn't have that big epic sort of grandeur, and it's actually quite a tightly contained little story, and it happens with this sort of smaller group of characters primarily, and in one or two sort of locations. It's not grand and sweeping and happening over many decades. It's quite a tightly contained little story, but it has the feel of something much bigger. It has the feel of a big epic, and I think that's a big part of this film. There's lots of other things I really like about this movie. It's a good story. The characters are engaging. It's well acted. I really like little things about this film, like the beginning of the movie where you have Omar Sharif, who's playing the character of Melchizedek, and Antonio Banderas is our main character. Melchizedek is someone who starts the journey with him, but then sort of very early on in the film leaves him to carry on the journey on his own. And Antonio Banderas is this character who's come from the Muslim lands and who ends up amidst this group of Viking warriors as this whole story involving these Viking cultures and sort of other cultures around them unfolds. And Antonio Banderas does not speak the Viking language. And so you've got this great thing happening at the beginning, which I thought was really clever, because what they could have done is they could have just had subtitles, but they didn't do that. What you have is one of the Vikings who understands and speaks Greek. And so what he does is he translates what the Vikings are saying into Greek, and he tells Melchizedek. And Melchizedek then translates into the Arabic for Antonio Banderas, of his character, what's happening and what's being said. But then, of course, Melchizedek gets left behind, and Antonio Banderas' character becomes the 13th warrior, thus the title of the film, on this epic journey, and he can't speak the language. And it's very clever the way this unfolds, where he actually sits and just listens and listens and listens and learns their language over a period of probably, I guess, weeks and months. And I really love that scene where he finally, the way they do this, again, they could have done subtitles, but they didn't. He basically, bit by bit, he's breaking down to understand what their language is, and then all of a sudden he hears them, or we hear them in English. And this is a really clever little cinematic tool that actually is a great way of showing us and getting us inside that sort of concept of he's learnt their language, and it's just good. It's just a different way of doing things, and I really like that. It's a little thing, but I liked it. And why I liked it at the beginning with the translation between the Viking character who's translating for Melchizedek, who's then translating for Antonio Banderas, our main character, the 13th warrior, is that it actually brings characters who could have been on the periphery as mere observers. They're now observers who are very much part of the story. They're not left sitting on the sidelines watching as we see subtitles unfolding. They're very much brought into our focus as audience members. We're with them on the journey. They're part of our focus too, as well as understanding what's actually being said and what's going on in this Viking world. As I said, this is a film that feels like it's sort of come out of another era. It feels that maybe a 1980s sensibility, or even bigger, some of those big historical epic pieces that Hollywood is famous for. It has that kind of feel to it. What I love about this is it also comes from that era of cinema where there's no politics in this. It's not about trying to preach propaganda to you. It's just about telling a good old-fashioned adventure story. There's no franchise building. This film is not attempting to establish a cinematic universe. It's just a self-contained story. And it's really focused on great mythology and virtue and characters and a hero's journey, really. And it's well told. That's exactly what we get. And so you have things like camaraderie is a major theme. I mean, obviously they're a band of warriors. And you really feel the camaraderie. It actually feels real to you. And you feel you're bought into it. And it's the emotion of that is a big part of it. You're not just being told and shown it. You actually start to feel the camaraderie, the way this film is scripted and made, and it sort of draws you into that. And you also have, as I said, this final conclusion to this hero's journey where Antonio Banderas starts out as this, basically he's a bit of a scoundrel, really, who's got a problem with virtue. But by the end of the film, he's gone from being a pampered prince, basically, to a very heroic warrior who is self-sacrificial in his outlook on the world. And his character arc is just awesome in this film. He really does go from here to here over the period of this film. He's not the same character at the end, and it's a great example. You know, any budding script writers out there, go and watch this film. People want to see characters like this who develop in meaningful ways, and this character actually does that. And it's also a film that has great costumes. The costuming in this film, I think, is excellent. The world building itself is awesome. The sets, the sets are real. You've got lots of extras involved in these scenes. It's not relying on CGI tricks. It's actually lots of extras, real sets, and that makes a difference. Interestingly enough, for some reason, when I look at some of the sets in this film, to me it's a reminder and a bit of a precursor to what was about to come with Lord of the Rings. I think of particularly the Rohan set. And I see this as a sort of prefiguring of Rohan, even though they're obviously completely different films and directors and everything else. But you see the advantage of having actual sets and shooting on locations. And what you do is you notice in some of the big sweeping shots and the big panning shots is that you actually, it makes it more meaningful and it puts you in the location. It's not just a green screen, and it's not just a small sort of narrow little set they're working with. They're trying to sort of keep their shot within it because they don't want to go outside of it, and so you can see all the TV aerials and everything modern. They've got these big wide open vistas, and it makes a big difference in a film like this. I think it adds to the scale and to the feel of everything that's going on. There's some interesting little John McTiernan stuff in there too, like the action set pieces in this film. They are awesome. They are really good action set pieces. Also, there's that scene in the Forest Glen, which is towards the beginning of the film when they go and they begin their investigation of who is doing the killing. And they go to this farm that's in a forest. And basically in that scene where they're creeping through the forest and the way the camera angles that are used and the way it's shot and the visuals and the lighting and everything, you can definitely see you see the Predator callbacks there for sure. You see, you can literally just imagine, same director obviously, you can just imagine the Predator being present in this forest, and you realise that he's got a good eye for this kind of thing, and he's got a great way of choosing the shots that draw you into the suspense and that also make it something interesting to look at. It's not just flat and boring. There's some really interesting shots there, and when you get into the action set pieces, they're just great. They're really engaging. They're visually engaging. They draw you in, and you're on the edge of your seat. Even now, watching this film, all these years later, you still are engaged and engrossed in those set pieces. And as I said, a big part of that too is like he's directing actual extras here and actual armies. You've got extras on horses. I mean, everyone credits Lord of the Rings for doing this. And people often talk about the big, former Hollywood, the great historic epics. But this film, when you look at it, there's a lot of extras, and there's actually horse riders involved. There's cavalry involved in this. It would have taken a lot to actually marshal this, to plan those shots, to execute them. But this film does it really, really well. And on top of that, some of these scenes involving horseback cavalry, they're happening at night. So you've got to get the lighting and everything all coordinated on top of everything else. But this film does it, and it does it really, really well. This is a good film. It's a good action adventure film. It's a rollicking piece of mythology that draws you in and keeps you engaged. So why, oh why, did this film not stick in the public consciousness? Well, there's a couple of interesting things going on here. First of all, this ultimately is a swords and sandals epic, 4 years after Braveheart. So Braveheart starts off this big tsunami. The swords and sandals epic is given this huge revival under Braveheart. But this film is really too late to capture the Braveheart wave, and it is released the year before Gladiator. What does Gladiator do? 5-year cycle, I guess, I don't know. It kicks off another swords and sandals wave again. But this film is too early for that wave. It's too late for the former wave. So it gets stuck in a bit of a no man's land. It's really all about timing here. Not only that, but this film is also competing with another huge game-changing blockbuster that same year, and that is the film The Matrix. And The Matrix was a game changer. Remember how I said this was a bit of a constant theme here? Well, we saw this with Knowing competing with Avatar. Now this movie is up against The Matrix. And The Matrix wasn't just a film that had lots of hype. It was a film that actually changed cinema. And I still remember going into The Matrix and coming out of that film and going, holy moly, that was something different altogether. It's not quite, but it's almost like the original Star Wars type moment. Those moments are very rare in cinema. The Matrix was one of those moments. And so you've got this film here, The 13th Warrior, which is too late for the Braveheart Swords and Sandals wave. It's too early for the Gladiator one, and it's up against that same year, The Matrix. And it's not surprising because everyone is talking about The Matrix, and people are going for repeat viewings of The Matrix, and it's easy to see why a film like this got lost in the mix. But this is a really good film. It is still a great film. It holds up. Probably for the younger kids, it's not suitable for family movie night because there's a bit of violence in this film. But for older kids, yeah, this is sort of one of those films you can sit down and watch and with the older kids, the older family, and it's a rollicking good ride, a very enjoyable film with nothing too offensive in it. There's nothing, it just focuses on great mythology and great storytelling, and it's just so well shot. I really love this film. It still holds up, and I highly recommend it. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how you can do that are found in the video description below. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Left Foot Media. Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and over the last week or so, basically whenever I hit the treadmill, I have been working my way through the brand new Netflix documentary series about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, which, strangely enough, is called The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Now, there's probably not a person alive today who doesn't know at least something about this case, or has not actually heard the name Madeleine McCann. It's just such a high-profile case. In 2007, you've got this 3-year-old British girl who's on holiday with her family. She disappears from the villa where they are staying, and basically no one who's heard from, seen of, or knows anything about this. The crime remains unsolved, and it's still this big question: what actually happened to Madeleine McCann? Was she kidnapped? Is she dead? Were the parents involved? Was someone else involved? Was it an accident? Did they cover up the accident? All these questions have been swirling around this case for that long. In this documentary, for a true crime documentary, I think is actually pretty well crafted. Often true crime documentaries really frustrate me because what they tend to do is they actually aren't so much documentaries as they are advocacy pieces, and they're really about trying to present a case. And usually what happens when you get series like this that do that is they tend to selectively present evidence, or they cherry pick it, or they present it in such a way as to favour a particular conclusion, but they don't put all of the facts on the table. This documentary is not like that. It actually just puts everything out there, whether it's flattering or unflattering to any of the parties involved. It just puts all of the information on the table and gives you this complete overall timeline about what happened. Now, I'm someone who was familiar with this case, this crime, and thought I knew all about it, but I actually learned things watching this documentary. And interestingly enough, one of the big complaints, there's two major complaints I've seen online from people who have watched this documentary and reviewed it. Number one is people are saying, well, it didn't tell me anything new. There was no new evidence presented. And the other thing was people who were saying it just put all the information out there, and I was hoping for something a bit more definitive. And I actually think that that's a positive in this case, because like I said, it's not your typical true crime type documentary series that just quickly devolves into an advocacy piece. It actually just fairly presents everything. And towards the end, it's clearly heading in one direction, or it seems to be favouring a particular outcome. That's normal in a situation like this, but it's not heavy-handed, and as I said, it doesn't selectively cherry-pick evidence. It just puts all the information on the table, and you end up with largely a balanced presentation of all the ins and outs of the case, the evidence, and both for and against, and all the parties involved, all the accusations that have swirled around regarding this case. But basically, by the end of this documentary series, I have 6 questions that I've been thinking about a lot since I finished the last episode. Why didn't the McCanns participate in the documentary? And I don't understand this, because the documentary is not unfavourable towards them. It just puts all the evidence out there. Interestingly enough, close friends of theirs did participate, and they're interviewed, and they appear in, I think, every episode of this documentary, speaking very favourably about the McCanns. And the documentary does not in any way denigrate them. It doesn't in any way accuse them of anything. It puts all the information out on the table, including accusations that have been levelled against them by others, and evidence that wasn't necessarily particularly favourable to their claim that this was a kidnapping. But it doesn't seek to victimise, to denigrate, to vilify them at all. So I'm kind of surprised that they didn't participate. Now, one of the things I've read in response, and I don't know how true this is because, the media being what the media is, but several of the articles I've read about this seem to indicate that the McCanns chose not to participate because they felt it wouldn't help actually advance the case, and it wouldn't help find their daughter. But I kind of find that a little bit strange, because they have involved themselves in some very intensive, high-profile and wide-ranging PR efforts over the years since the disappearance. And it seems to me also that this documentary would be a help, because it's putting their case before the public again to a wide global audience, which surely is an advantage to them. So I'm just a little bit surprised by that. And as I said, at the end of the documentary series, I was left just questioning why they chose not to be involved in this series. The second question I have is this, and this is about the crime itself. Why would the parents do all of this, go to all of these lengths, if they were involved? It seems to me that this is a question that counts against the accusation that they were the perpetrators of this crime, that they've either accidentally caused the death of their daughter and then they've tried to cover it up, or they've deliberately caused the death and then tried to cover it up. It just seems to me that these lengths that they've gone to now afterwards are quite extreme. And that question to me does count against the suggestion that they've actually been involved in this crime themselves. They're responsible for it. However, in response to that, I'd imagine people would say, well, isn't it also equally possible that once the lie took off, if this is a lie, once the lie took off and the machine just basically grew and grew and grew, it effectively consumed them. And what's the only alternative that they've got now? And that's to carry on and to keep this beast alive, because the only other alternative would be to actually have your reputations completely destroyed, and you'd be going to prison for the crime. And so it seems that the only way to avoid that would be to keep, if this is a lie, to keep the lie going. But it does seem strange that parents would go to all of these lengths, and that they would keep this, like both of them. I can understand one person, but both of them, and then even sort of friends of theirs around. As far as I'm aware, no close friends have raised doubts about the innocence of the McCanns. So I think that to me is an important question that's a big and serious question that sort of counts against the theory that maybe they were involved. If the parents did do this, where is the body? What happened to the body? Because it seems to me that if the parents have actually done this, then they would have had to have disposed of the body at some point, or organised for the body to be disposed of. And it seems that given all the publicity and the journalistic focus that was on this case, their window for doing that would have been very limited. But I think it's an important question. Where did the body end up? Why has the body not been found all of this time? Now, they were at a coastal resort town, so it's quite possible that I guess disposing of it in the sea could have been a way that this was done if they were involved in the crime. But there's still big questions about when exactly they would have done this and how they would have got away with this with no one actually seeing them do that. And interestingly enough, the documentary, because the documentary is very fair and balanced, and it doesn't get into this territory of trying to present a hypothesis about who did it and how they would have committed the crime, and just plucking all sorts of information out of the air to try and craft, a story or a narrative about how this crime was committed. It doesn't really explore those questions about how possibly someone could have actually done this if the McCanns themselves were involved. Which, as I said, is a positive about this documentary. But to me, that question also is a big and important question. If they did do this, what the heck did they do with the body? Where is the body? What happened to the body? What motive would the members of the McCann party, that dinner party, have for actually lying? Because there's this very brief idea, or it's this brief, what you might call a brief suggestion, that's introduced into the documentary, that perhaps the dinner party were not telling the truth when they claimed that they were getting up every 20 minutes or so to check on the children, or that they had line of sight. Because the dinner party, remember, were actually at a restaurant. They were not in the same villa. They were not even in the same building where Madeleine McCann was, where the children were when this crime took place, or when the disappearance happened. So they claimed they had line of sight from the restaurant where they were eating. They claimed they were getting up every 20 minutes or so to go and check on the children. Now, those two things were challenged in this documentary. It's very brief, but they were challenged in this documentary. But that raises the question, well, what possible motive would all of those people have for lying? Because it's one thing to have one person commit a crime and cover it up, or a couple of people, particularly a husband and wife, but it seems to me that you're really getting into sort of questionable territory to suggest that they would all willingly go along with lying. Surely, if they knew that the truth wasn't being told, that would tell them that in actual fact their friends, the McCanns, were involved in this crime. And I think most people... you'd have to be, I think, a particularly special kind of evil person to keep that covered up just because you were friends with someone. It seems to me that when you talk about a crime involving a child, that people, even friends of other people, would actually say, well, no, they weren't telling the truth, or no, we didn't go and check on them. And it just seems strange why they would... what motive would they have for lying? And basically the fact that they don't really have a strong motivation to lie tends to disprove the theory that some people were saying, and which was put out there in this documentary, that maybe they hadn't told the truth. Unless they just feel guilty, Maybe, I guess the possible response to that is that maybe they didn't tell the truth. They didn't have line of sight. They weren't actually checking every 20 minutes. They felt guilty about that. They didn't want to admit to the world that they had failed in their duty of care. Maybe they had a few too many drinks. They didn't want to look like they were negligent, and their negligence had led to the disappearance or the kidnapping of a young girl, or to a crime being perpetrated against her. So they just told a lie in order to save their own reputations. But to me, it just seems strange that they wouldn't have actually come out. As far as I'm aware, they haven't come out and said, no, in actual fact, the McCanns are not telling the truth here about the timeline and what went on. Question number 5 I have is this, and to me, I guess this is a haunting question. If Madeleine McCann was the victim of a kidnapping, would she even know who she actually is today? Assuming she's still alive and the victim of a kidnapping, would she even know? She'd be about 15 years of age now. Would she have memories of her younger self, her former life before the kidnapping? Is it possible that even if she did have those memories when she was kidnapped, that she could have been brainwashed out of those memories through just a series of repetitive lies being told to her, and effectively as a young child becoming convinced that, her former life wasn't real? If she is, she's 15, but she has those memories from when she was a 3-year-old, and she actually does remember parts of her former life. Why hasn't she come forward? Now, that's a haunting question, because if she was the victim of kidnapping and she does remember her former life and enough to actually know, hey, this could be me, the fact that she hasn't come forward would indicate that one of two things: that either she is no longer alive, or number 2, that she's not able to. She's not in a position where she can alert anyone. There's no one to actually tell that she is the victim of this crime, and here she is, please someone come and get me. And so that's quite a haunting question to actually think about, the possibility that particularly if she has no memory of her former life, that there is an older Madeleine McCann out there who has been the victim of a kidnapping but has no idea who she actually is. She is now living her life as she's living a lie basically, and has no concept at all about who she is. And that's quite haunting, because you think about the prospect of what that could mean, that her parents may never ever see her again, and she may never ever know, ever in her lifetime, that she actually was this young girl who was kidnapped. She actually really is Madeleine McCann, and these people are her real parents. And question number 6, and this for me is the most important question of all, and this is about the most damning piece of evidence that was raised in this documentary. But interestingly enough, the documentary never ever goes back and satisfyingly answers or gives answers to this question. And this is, as I said, the most important question of all for me is this. Number 6,